Welcome to True Echo, where every story resonates with truth, justice, and unforgettable courage. Today's story follows a 14-year-old boy who walked into a bank with nothing but a scholarship check, a notebook, and a dream. What he uncovered instead was a hidden layer of discrimination, and a scandal that would bring an entire financial system to its knees. This isn't just about racism, it's about the power of truth when written down and the fire it ignites when spoken aloud. Stay with us. The morning light filtered through the tall glass windows of Prestige Oak Federal Bank, splashing golden hues across the polished marble floor. 14-year-old Elijah Carter stood just beyond the massive brass handles of the front door, staring at the gilded logo etched into the glass. His reflection stared back, a boy in a navy blue blazer, striped school tie, and well-worn brown leather shoes. A badge from Wester Academy, one of the most elite schools in the country, gleamed on his chest. In his hand, he held a folded letter, a formal scholarship award for academic excellence. Not need-based. Not a diversity handout. A recognition of pure merit. Tucked securely in his backpack was the accompanying $5,000 check, his name printed clearly across the top. He took a steady breath. "I want to do this on my own, Dad," he had said the night before, placing the letter on their kitchen table with a mix of pride and purpose. "I think it's time I start learning how to manage my money." Daniel Carter, billionaire investor, public figure, and founder of Carter & Cole Investments, had looked at his son, smile faint but full of respect. "Then walk in like a Carter. But more importantly, walk in like yourself." Now, as Elijah stepped into the grand lobby, the scent of oakwood, expensive leather, and faint antiseptic filled his lungs. Grown men in tailored suits chatted at the VIP desk. A security guard nodded to a white family exiting with complimentary gift bags. An elderly couple sipped lattes near the mortgage office. Elijah was the only child in the room. Still, he stood tall. He approached the teller counter after waiting patiently in line. When his turn arrived, he stepped forward and smiled at the young man behind the glass. "Good morning," he said politely, unfolding his papers. "I'd like to deposit this into my account. It's my scholarship." Tom Reeves, the teller, gave a half-smile as he reached for the check. His eyes scanned the amount, then blinked, paused, and narrowed. His mouth tightened, and a faint crease formed between his brows. "You received this? Personally?" Tom asked, his tone turning cautious. "Yes," Elijah replied. "From Wester Academy. All the documents are here." He slid the scholarship confirmation, his student ID, and a copy of his birth certificate toward the counter, proof of everything. Tom looked over the documents without really reading them. Instead, he tapped the check against the desk and turned to a nearby colleague. Within moments, the sound of heels clicking sharply against the marble cut through the lobby's ambient hum. Victoria Hayes appeared. Branch manager. Ice blonde curls. Custom-tailored vest. Gold name badge. And the chilling air of someone who didn't question her authority, she expected deference. She didn't look at Elijah directly. Just at the check in Tom's hand. $5,000, she said aloud, ensuring nearby customers could hear. "That's a large amount for a child. Where did he get it?" Elijah felt his heart thump once. Not fear, but offense. The way she said he echoed in his chest like a blade. "I earned it," Elijah replied calmly, offering his paperwork again. "I'm a student at Wester Academy. This is a merit-based scholarship." Victoria crossed her arms, scanning him head to toe with a glance that said it all, "Not someone who belongs here. We've had incidents with fake checks lately." "It needs to be verified," she said coldly. "That's fine. May I call my dad? He's waiting for me." "You can wait," she replied. "Not our concern." Her voice was laced with polite venom. Then, with a flick of her wrist, she gestured to the security guard, Carter Briggs, and walked off, heels clicking again like punctuation to her sentence. "You don't belong here." Elijah stood motionless in the middle of the room. Customers glanced his way. Some turned. Others whispered. But none stepped forward. No one asked what was happening. He was alone. He shifted toward the corner where he had been told to stand and gripped the straps of his backpack tightly. Minutes dragged. 5. 10. 15. No one addressed him. No one came to explain. He wasn't being served anymore. He was being watched. And yet, he didn't sit. He didn't cry. He didn't fidget. He pulled out a small black notebook from his backpack. Flipped to an empty page. And began to write. 10:22 a.m. Check deposited at teller 3. Teller froze at amount. Victoria Hayes approached. No documents reviewed. I was told to wait for verification. Denied phone call to Dad. He paused. His hands weren't shaking, not yet. But something inside him simmered, rising slowly like pressure in a sealed container. Not just anger, injustice. He looked up at the teller. Tom Reeves was now chatting casually with another customer. The check Elijah had brought was nowhere in sight. The security guard hadn't moved, still watching him from a short distance. The air had shifted. Elijah wasn't a student anymore. He was now a risk. His eyes scanned the room. A white woman passed him, clutching her purse tighter. A middle-aged man shook his head in disbelief, muttering something under his breath. Another teller leaned in toward her colleague, whispering behind her hand. All of them saw him. None of them saw a child. Just a black boy with a check. And then, Elijah noticed something that made his skin prickle. Across the lobby, Victoria Hayes reappeared, but this time she wasn't pacing. She was smiling. Not at him. At a tall man in a beige suit who had just entered through the side door, briefcase in hand. They shook hands like old friends. Victoria led him toward a side conference room, pulled a sealed yellow envelope from behind the desk, and passed it discreetly into his hand. Elijah's breath caught in his throat. That was not standard banking procedure. The man, whom Elijah instantly recognized as Harrison Wells, CEO of Meridian Banking Group and a known competitor of his father's company, didn't even sign anything. Just flipped open the envelope, nodded once, and tucked it into his case. Then left. Elijah's notebook was open again in seconds. 10:47 a.m. Harrison Wells enters. Victoria Hayes hands him confidential file. No witness. No documentation. File removed from premises. He closed the notebook gently. He had come to deposit a scholarship. Instead, he had discovered a scandal. A betrayal. And now, he was a witness. Victoria Hayes turned and met his eyes. Her smile was gone. What replaced it was sharper, calculating. She knew. She knew he had seen. And in that moment, Elijah understood something deeper. This wasn't just about being black. This wasn't just about racism. This was about power. Who had it? Who didn't? And who was willing to break every rule to keep it? Elijah didn't move. He stood exactly where Victoria Hayes had left him, near the consultation desk, framed by expensive wooden chairs and frosted glass dividers that offered privacy to everyone but him. Around him, the polished grandeur of Prestige Oak Federal Bank gleamed, and yet every reflection felt warped, as if the building itself was designed to exclude him. The truth was lodged like a stone in his chest. He had seen something. Something real. Something corrupt. And though no one else seemed to notice the man in the beige suit or the discreet file exchange, Elijah had. He had written it down. Documented the time, the faces, the file. And now, Victoria Hayes knew. The moment their eyes met, a different kind of tension settled in the air, no longer contempt, but calculation. A new game had begun, and Elijah had become more than an unwanted guest. He was now a liability. Across the room, the sound of keys clacking, printers humming, and coffee being poured continued as if nothing had changed. But to Elijah, every footstep sounded heavier. Every glance lingered a little longer. He returned to his notebook and added one more line. 10:53 a.m. Victoria Hayes saw me watching. She knows I saw everything. His handwriting remained neat, steady, an anchor in the storm building behind his ribs. Suddenly, a shadow fell over him. Carter Briggs, the security guard, had moved again. This time, he stood just to Elijah's right, arms folded, blocking the nearest hallway with his large frame. There was no expression on his face, no cruelty, no kindness. Just that cold, professional indifference that meant orders had been given. "Don't wander off," he said without looking at Elijah. "Manager's still verifying." Elijah didn't answer. Didn't nod. Just tightened his grip on his backpack straps. Inside the bag, the check was gone. Locked away, likely placed in some drawer or safe. But the real value, the truth, was in the notebook still in his hand. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, suddenly aware that no one had told him he could sit. No chair had been offered. No apology made. He was in the corner, literally and figuratively. Just then, a soft voice reached his ears. "Are you okay?" He turned. Melody Tran, one of the younger bank employees, was passing by, a stack of files clutched to her chest. Her expression wasn't exaggerated. Just the quiet concern of someone who saw everything and knew she couldn't fix it. Elijah nodded once. That was all he could allow himself. Melody didn't linger. But the moment she disappeared into the hallway, a new sound filled the room, the clicking of high heels. Victoria was back. She walked briskly toward the center of the bank, stopping by the reception desk. From there, she looked directly at Carter Briggs and gave a slight tilt of her head. No words. Just the signal. Carter moved instantly. "Elijah Carter," he said gruffly. Elijah stiffened. "I need you to come with me." "Why?" Elijah asked, his voice low but firm. "Is the check verified now?" "Manager just wants a word." Elijah's heart thundered. Every instinct screamed at him to stay in the open, to remain where the chandeliers glowed, where people could see him. But he also knew what would happen if he resisted. They would twist it. He would be labeled uncooperative. A problem. Possibly even aggressive. And he couldn't afford that. So he nodded slowly and followed Carter Briggs, clutching his notebook tightly. Every step down that hallway felt like walking deeper into a trap. The walls were beige. The carpeting thick and sound-absorbing. There were no windows here. No noise. Just silence, calculated and suffocating. They reached a small private room marked staff consultation only. Carter opened the door and gestured inside. Elijah stepped in. The room was cold. Too cold. It had a plastic chair, a small desk, a printer, and no camera in sight. The door shut behind him with a soft but definitive click. Carter didn't speak again. He stood at the door, arms folded, ensuring Elijah knew exactly who controlled the space. Minutes passed. Elijah sat down, his legs stiff. He placed his backpack on his lap, his notebook hidden beneath it. He waited. Then, through the quiet, he heard the familiar chime of the main bank doors opening. And then, silence again. But it wasn't nothing. Elijah had learned from his father, silence is never empty. It hides things. It prepares things. Suddenly, loud footsteps approached. A voice, male, strong, unmistakable, rang through the hallway. "Where is my son?" Elijah's breath caught. He knew that voice. Daniel Carter had arrived. The door flung open. Daniel filled the doorway like a tidal wave of control and presence. His tailored charcoal suit, pressed shirt and steel gray tie did not scream. They stated. His eyes scanned the room, instantly landing on his son. "Are you all right?" he asked, calm but deadly quiet. Elijah stood, unable to hold it anymore. They said my check might be fake. They wouldn't let me call you. And then I saw," he stopped, looking down at his notebook. Daniel's jaw clenched, but he didn't erupt. He turned to Carter Briggs. "Step aside." Carter hesitated. I said, "Step aside." This time the tone was sharper, colder, honed to a legal edge. The kind of tone that ends careers. Carter obeyed, opening the door wider. Daniel stepped inside, placed his hand firmly on his son's shoulder, and said simply, "Let's go." Together, they walked out. Back into the lobby. Every head turned. The man who had once sat silently, now walked like he owned the building. And in a way, he did. Carter and Cole was one of the biggest stakeholders in Oak Federal. Victoria saw them coming. She straightened, smoothed her blazer, and offered a rehearsed smile. "Mr. Carter," she said. "What a surprise." Daniel didn't smile. He reached into his inner coat pocket, pulled out a small business card, and handed it to her. "Corporate legal. I expect a call in 1 hour. You are now under formal review for misconduct, discrimination, and potentially corporate collusion." Victoria's eyes flicked to Elijah. He was acting strange. "We needed verification." Daniel interrupted her, calm as ice. "No. What you did was profile a child. And worse, you gave sensitive bank documents to a man under investigation for insider trading." He raised Elijah's notebook high. "It's all here. And now it's going to the board." Silence blanketed the room. Tom Reeves dropped the pen in his hand. Melody Tran looked down, visibly shaken. Victoria paled. Elijah, for the first time in nearly an hour, took a deep breath. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't resisted. He had documented. And now, the entire bank would face the consequences. The silence in the lobby of Prestige Oak Federal Bank was different now. It was no longer the silence of dismissal, or the silence that comes from pretending not to see. It was the silence of reckoning, the kind that follows a thunderclap before the rain begins to fall. Daniel Carter stood with his hand firmly on his son's shoulder. The black notebook Elijah had used to document every moment now sat open in his other palm, its pages glowing like a mirror to the institution's failure. Victoria Hayes's polished exterior was still intact, but the cracks were beginning to show. Her voice, normally cold and smooth, came out tight and brittle. "Mr. Carter, I think you may be overreacting. We had procedures to follow." Daniel turned to her with calm precision. "You didn't follow procedure. You profiled a child, detained a minor without cause, refused a phone call, and then leaked confidential documents to Harrison Wells, who is, in case you've forgotten, under federal investigation." The name Harrison Wells hit the room like a dropped piano. Even employees who had tried to keep their heads down now glanced up, eyes wide. Elijah watched as Tom Reeves, the teller who first froze at the check, paled visibly. Daniel didn't need to raise his voice. He had long ago learned that power doesn't shout, it arrives. He handed the notebook to Victoria. "Go ahead. Read it." Victoria opened it with trembling fingers. Line after line, timestamp after timestamp, each entry a blow to her credibility. 10:22 a.m., check deposited. Teller froze. 10:25 a.m., Victoria arrives. Refuses to view documents. 10:47 a.m., Harrison Wells enters. Receives confidential file. 10:53 a.m., Victoria realizes I saw. 11:05 a.m., I'm taken to private room. No phone call allowed. Victoria's hand shook slightly as she closed the notebook. There's no context here. There doesn't need to be, Daniel cut in, pulling out his phone. The moment you detained my son, you crossed a line. The moment you handed confidential documents to a competitor, you committed a crime. He turned to the room, addressing not just Victoria, but everyone watching. This bank prides itself on professionalism, on integrity. Today, it failed at both. Somewhere in the back, a customer softly clapped. Just once. Then again. Then Melody Tran, her face calm but resolute, stepped forward from her desk. "Sir," she said, addressing Daniel, "I saw what happened. Everything your son wrote, it's accurate." Victoria turned sharply. "Melody." No, Melody's voice didn't rise, but it didn't waver. "You told me last week not to smile too much at non-white clients. I thought it was just tone deaf. I thought maybe I misread you. But today." She looked at Elijah. "Today, I saw exactly what this place has become." For a moment, the silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was full of choice. People were deciding, right then, which side of the story they wanted to be on. And more than that, which version of themselves they could live with after today. Victoria straightened her spine. "You can't fire me," she hissed. "I've been here 19 years. I've built this branch. And you've poisoned it," Daniel said flatly. "Effective immediately, you are suspended pending formal review. The corporate board has already been notified. I've also sent Elijah's notebook to our legal team and compliance officers." He turned to a different guard at the side entrance. "Escort Ms. Hayes off the premises." The new guard hesitated. Victoria barked, "You're all making a mistake." No one moved to stop the security guard. He gently but firmly gestured toward the door. As she stormed past Elijah and Daniel, her eyes locked onto the boys one last time. But Elijah didn't flinch. He held her gaze, calm, unshaken. In that moment, he wasn't a child anymore. He was the reason her empire was crumbling. Once the doors closed behind her, the lobby released a collective breath it hadn't realized it was holding. Daniel turned to Elijah. "Do you want to go home?" Elijah looked up, then shook his head. "No. I want to deposit my check." Tom Reeves flinched. "I'll handle it," Melody said quietly. She walked around to the teller counter, held her hand out for the documents, and with a dignity missing from every other adult Elijah had dealt with that morning, she processed the deposit quickly, professionally, and without a single unnecessary comment. When she handed back the receipt, she smiled. "Congratulations on your scholarship. You earned this." Elijah thanked her, then turned to his father. Daniel looked around the room, at the watching employees, the stunned customers, the frozen cameras, and said in a voice clear and slow, "From this moment forward, every employee at this branch will undergo mandatory equity training, and internal affairs will be reviewing all prior customer complaints. If any of you have experienced similar treatment, you're not alone." Melody's eyes shimmered. Daniel placed a final hand on Elijah's shoulder. "And if any of you ever wonder whether truth still matters, remember this morning. Because it does." Then, with his son beside him, Daniel Carter walked out the same doors his son had entered through just an hour earlier, but this time, Elijah was no longer walking alone. He was walking ahead. 3 weeks passed. In that short window of time, the name Elijah Carter moved from the pages of a school scholarship letter to headlines across the country. Not because of what he shouted, but because of what he wrote. What began as a humiliating moment inside Prestige Oak Federal Bank had rippled outward with shocking force. The first wave hit the executive board. Daniel Carter, true to his word, submitted the black notebook as formal evidence to the bank's legal and compliance departments. Within 48 hours, an emergency review panel was convened. Victoria Hayes was officially terminated, and a formal investigation was opened into unauthorized data transmission to outside competitors. Her files were seized. Her hard drives pulled. Emails between her and Harrison Wells, CEO of Meridian Banking Group, were uncovered. Wells had received privileged information. Data on loan performance, regional market forecasting, and client migration projections. Details only an insider could access. And Elijah, a 14-year-old boy, had witnessed the handoff. The second wave hit the public. Snippets of Elijah's quiet stand, the notebook, the quote, "You don't have the privilege of getting angry," went viral. A short video clip of Daniel's confrontation with Victoria, recorded by a bank client who had remained silent during the incident, surfaced on TikTok. Then Instagram. Then CNN. Suddenly, Elijah's story wasn't just about banking or race, it was about power. It was about how the right to be heard could be denied, even with perfect paperwork, perfect grades, and perfect composure, and how reclaiming that right could crack open a hidden system. Inside the Carter household, things were changing, too. Daniel watched his son differently now, not with pride alone, but with respect. The kind of respect only earned by those who refuse to break when everything tries to bend them. "You didn't just stand still," Daniel said one night on their balcony. "You stood for something." Elijah looked down at his notebook. "I just wrote what happened." Daniel chuckled softly. "That's the part people forget, son. History isn't made by those who scream loudest. It's made by the ones who keep receipts. Underscore 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 underscore. At Wester Academy, Elijah's return was quiet, at least at first. His classmates whispered. Some congratulated him. Some kept their distance. A few, especially those from families who knew someone at Oak Federal, dismissed it all as a media stunt. But then came the assembly. Leading the Path to Justice, it was called, a school initiative for civic courage and personal ethics. It had been in the planning phase for months, but the board shifted gears. They had a new keynote speaker. And he wasn't a lawyer. Or a professor. Or a politician. He was a ninth-grade boy with a blazer, a scholarship, and a black leather notebook. When Elijah stepped onto the stage of the school auditorium, hundreds of students from across the state sat in hushed silence. The spotlight wasn't blinding, but it was enough to remind him, they're listening. He cleared his throat. No slides. No podium. Just his voice. I went to the bank that day thinking I was about to learn something about money. I thought depositing my check was a small step toward growing up. He paused. But what I really learned, was how many places are still designed to make kids like me feel small. The crowd didn't move. Elijah continued. I wasn't loud. I didn't argue. I didn't throw anything. I wrote everything down. Because when they try to erase your voice, writing becomes your witness. The notebook I carried wasn't just for homework. It became my protection. Someone in the crowd audibly gasped. And then, from the front row, Elijah saw her, Mrs. Bennett, his homeroom teacher. She'd once told him during a class discussion to soften his tone, because people might perceive him as confrontational. Now, she sat with her hands clasped tight, eyes brimming with tears. Elijah looked down at the notebook in his hand. I don't want to be remembered as the boy who got detained, he said. I want to be remembered as the boy who didn't look away when something was wrong, even when everyone else did. The applause didn't start right away. It exploded. It began with a clap from the back, then surged forward like a wave. Students stood. Teachers stood. Even those who didn't know Elijah personally now saw him as something far more powerful than a student. He was a reminder that truth doesn't need age or title, just courage. That same evening, back at Prestige Oak Federal, changes had already begun. Victoria's private office was permanently shuttered. Her nameplate removed. A new manager, a quiet but principled man named Gregory Chen, was appointed interim branch director. Internal memos required that all staff, from teller to executive, attend bias and ethics training. More importantly, the board initiated a new policy based directly on Elijah's experience. Any customer under 18 had the right to a phone call during prolonged transactions, a basic courtesy that, astonishingly, had never been written down before. Melody Tran, the employee who had whispered, "Are you okay?" was promoted to assistant manager. Not because she had shouted or protested, but because she had seen. And more importantly, the board realized, she had not looked away. Meanwhile, Elijah's inbox began to fill with messages. Some were from strangers. Others were from students just like him. I was told to remove my hoodie in a store because I looked suspicious. I didn't say anything. But now I wish I had. My teacher told me my accent would hurt my debate scores. I never told anyone. Until now. I used to think silence kept me safe. Your story made me realize silence is also a prison. Each message was a ripple from the moment Elijah had chosen to speak up, not by yelling, but by documenting. Elijah Carter wasn't trying to go viral. He was trying to deposit a check. And yet, through one act of quiet resistance, he had become the spark that revealed cracks in an entire institution, and gave others the strength to see their own stories more clearly. He didn't want fame. He wanted change. And for the first time in his life, he felt it, not just the burden of truth, but its weight when finally shared. On the 27th floor of Carter & Cole's downtown headquarters, Daniel Carter sat in his private office. The skyline glowed through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him, but his attention wasn't on the city. It was on a screen. Elijah's speech, now dubbed "The Notebook That Spoke Back," had been clipped and circulated by countless media outlets. But Daniel wasn't watching the edits. He was watching the full raw recording from Wester Academy's auditorium, streamed by the school itself. He watched his son stand there, calm, poised, deliberate. There were no theatrics, no dramatics, just truth. And it landed harder than any shouting ever could. When Elijah said, "They may steal your words, but no one can steal the truth when you write it down," Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair and exhaled. He had walked into Prestige Oak Bank 3 weeks earlier as a CEO. But he had left as something more, a witness to his son's awakening. The notification light blinked on Daniel's desk. New email, from Internal Legal Department. Subject, Victoria Hayes, Disciplinary Review Outcome. He opened it. The contents were short but clear. Victoria Hayes has been officially dismissed for cause, including breach of confidentiality, racial discrimination, and abuse of managerial power. She will not be eligible for rehire within the Prestige Oak Network or any of its partner institutions. Daniel closed the message and stared at his son's photo, not the formal one taken for school, but a candid shot from a fishing trip they had taken 2 summers ago. Elijah was holding a trout half his size, grinning with lopsided braces. That boy still existed. But something else had emerged now. Something Daniel could never have manufactured, no matter how powerful he was. Conviction. And outside Daniel's office walls, the world was starting to recognize it too. That week, the Carter home turned into a whirlwind of letters, calls, and visitors. Journalists requested interviews. Advocacy groups asked Elijah to speak. A foundation offered him an honorary award for youth justice leadership. But Elijah declined most of it. "I'm not finished understanding what happened," he told his father quietly. "Not just to me, but to people who never got to speak up." Instead of going to interviews, Elijah spent time reading. Learning about redlining, systemic bias, school-to-prison pipelines, and the legacy of mistrust Black Americans faced in banking institutions across the country. Every new fact hit harder, not because it was unfamiliar, but because now, it had a name. His own. He wasn't an outlier. He was a statistic with a story that refused to stay quiet. That Friday night, Elijah sat on the living room floor, surrounded by papers and notes. His mother, Camille, peeked in from the kitchen. "You've been at that for hours, baby," she said gently. "Don't you want to rest?" Elijah didn't look up. "I think I know what I want to do." She sat beside him. He handed her a rough outline, not of an essay, but a program. The Carter Ledger Project. A student-led initiative to teach middle and high school students how to document injustice, safely advocate for themselves, and understand their legal rights, especially in institutions where they may be treated unfairly due to race, class, or background. Camille looked up, her eyes wide. "You wrote this?" Elijah nodded. "I want to help kids like me, before they have to stand in a bank lobby with no one beside them." She pulled him into a hug. "You're going to help a lot more than that." The following Monday, Elijah received an unexpected letter. Not an email. A handwritten envelope. The sender? Board of Governors, Prestige Oak Federal Bank. Inside was a formal apology. But more than that, an offer. "Mr. Elijah Carter, in acknowledgement of your experience, bravery, and clarity of documentation, the Board of Governors would like to offer you an honorary position on our new Youth Accountability Advisory Panel. Your perspective is not only welcome, it is necessary." Elijah blinked. He read it twice. 3 times. When he showed the letter to his father, Daniel didn't say a word. He simply extended his hand, not in business, but in respect. Elijah shook it. A gesture from one man to another. The panel met a month later. 5 teenagers. 3 adults. One mission, to review discrimination complaints, evaluate institutional policy gaps, and advise on customer service standards, especially regarding youth and marginalized clients. Elijah sat at the long glass table in the same building where he was once detained like a criminal. Now, he was shaping the rules. He wasn't alone either. Melody Tran, recently promoted and now vocal within the employee union, joined as a staff liaison. And during the first meeting, she turned to Elijah, her voice stronger than it had been in the bank. "You gave us a way to see what we were too afraid to face." Elijah didn't speak for attention. He didn't gloat. He simply laid his notebook on the table and said, "Let's make sure no kid ever has to use this the way I did." That night, back home, he looked out over the neighborhood from his bedroom window. His notebook sat open beside him, no longer just a record of injustice, but now a blueprint for change. He jotted down one more line. Note to self, power isn't always about being the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it's about being the quietest, and the most prepared. It had been 2 months since Elijah Carter first walked into Prestige Oak Federal Bank with nothing but a $5,000 scholarship check and a belief in fairness. 2 months since he was told, without words, but through every glance and every denial, that he didn't belong. And now, he was sitting at the head of a long, oak conference table in that same bank's executive meeting room. Elijah didn't wear a suit. He didn't need one. His Wester Academy uniform, polished shoes, and that now iconic black leather notebook were enough. It wasn't about appearance. It was about presence. And every adult in the room, from regional directors to public policy consultants, understood that this teenager had forced their entire institution to wake up. Today's meeting was different. Because this wasn't just about apologies, or reviews, or damage control. This was the first official hearing on customer treatment complaints stemming from Elijah's case. But more importantly, it was public. Media representatives were in attendance. So were nonprofit observers from racial justice groups. It was the first time in Prestige Oak's 120-year history that a student-led advisory panel was allowed to review internal cases. Elijah listened intently as a woman named Lisa Morales, a 37-year-old single mother, recounted how she had been turned away at the same branch after bringing her son's social security card to open a child savings account. They said I looked like I'd borrowed the child, Lisa said softly. They wanted additional documents. Even when I brought in his birth certificate and our IDs the next day, they told me the system was down and asked me to leave. Elijah didn't interrupt. He wrote. Carefully. Slowly. Then he asked, "Did they ever follow up with you after that second visit?" "No," she said. "I never heard from them again." He nodded, then underlined something in his notebook. The room was quiet. Not out of discomfort, but out of attention. Later, when the meeting concluded, Elijah stood and addressed the board. "These stories aren't new," he said. "They didn't start with me, and they won't stop unless you all change how you look at people before they speak. The system didn't fail by accident, it was built to. The only question now is whether you're willing to rebuild it." One of the senior executives, an older white man named Michael Aldrich, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "I'll admit something, Mr. Carter," he said. "I was skeptical when this panel was first proposed. I thought it was performative. But hearing you speak today..." He glanced at his notepad. "You're doing more than most adults I know." Elijah didn't respond with a smile or thanks. He simply replied, "Then start listening to kids like me before we need a notebook to be believed." Later that afternoon, as Elijah and his father rode down the elevator in silence, Daniel placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "You handled that like a man today." Elijah looked up at him. "A man?" Daniel smirked. "Correction. Better than most men I've met." Elijah laughed quietly. As they exited the building, they were met by a small group of students holding signs, nothing aggressive. Just handwritten cardboard with words like, "We see you, Elijah." More notebooks. Fewer excuses. This is how change begins. Some were from his school. Some weren't. Most were young. One of the girls, maybe 11, handed him a small journal. On the front, she had written, "My first notebook. Thanks to you." Elijah didn't know what to say. So he just nodded. Because the words didn't need to come from him anymore. They were already spreading. That evening, a special news segment aired on national television, "The Boy Who Brought Down the Bank Wall." It covered everything, from the discriminatory incident, to the exposure of confidential leaks, to Elijah's new role on the advisory panel. But what caught the nation's attention wasn't the corporate scandal. It was the notebook. How a 14-year-old, with a quiet mind and a steady hand, had turned an ordinary object into a symbol of justice. News anchors quoted his speech. Commentators debated what it said about institutional failure. But the public, the people, knew what it meant. In homes across the country, parents handed their children notebooks, saying, "Start writing things down. Speak when it's right. But always know when to observe." By the end of the week, 3 other banks had announced internal reviews of their youth account policies. A major nonprofit offered to partner with Elijah's school to build curriculum around ethical observation, student rights, and financial literacy. Daniel received calls from governors, corporate executives, even celebrities asking to meet Elijah. But every time someone offered Elijah the spotlight, he gave the same answer. "I don't want attention. I want systems to change." And change, they did. One morning, while Elijah was organizing his materials for the next panel meeting, he received a letter by certified mail. The sender? Harrison Wells. He opened it slowly. Inside was a single typed page. No greeting. No apology. Just a short message. "Congratulations. You won. I underestimated you. That was my mistake. Don't make the same one with others." No signature. Just a typed name. H. Wells. Elijah stared at the letter for a moment. Then carefully placed it in the back of his notebook and wrote below it, Even the powerful take notice, when the powerless speak clearly enough. Then he shut the book. Not because the story was over, but because he was ready for the next chapter. The spring air was cool and fresh on the campus of Wester Academy as students gathered under the grand archways of the main courtyard. Banners of navy and gold fluttered overhead, bearing the school's motto, Veritas. Integritas. Disciplina. Truth. Integrity. Discipline. But today, those weren't just words on cloth. They were alive, embodied in the young man now stepping onto the open-air stage, black notebook in hand, his blazer buttoned tight, his posture calm and sure. Elijah Carter, age 14, stood at the podium. He wasn't there to accept an award. He wasn't there to talk about money, fame, or viral headlines. He was there to close the circle, and pass the notebook forward. Behind him sat faculty, guests, state officials, and even a few board members from Prestige Oak Federal Bank. The bank had since implemented 3 new national youth financial policies, all inspired by Elijah's experience. Seated in the front row was his father, Daniel Carter. Next to him sat Elijah's mother, Camille, and Melody Tran, now the official vice president of customer ethics at the bank, thanks to her testimony. But Elijah's eyes weren't on them. They were on the students. Black, brown, white, and everything in between. Some wealthy. Some poor. Some shy. Some defiant. But all watching him like he had something they needed, not fame or influence. Permission. Permission to speak. Permission to be heard. Permission to matter. Elijah opened the notebook one final time. "I was just trying to deposit a scholarship check," he said into the microphone, voice clear, calm. "I didn't think I was going to be detained, questioned, or humiliated. I didn't think I'd be treated like a criminal for having the wrong skin color in the wrong bank at the wrong time." A quiet, uneasy murmur swept the courtyard. "But that's what happened," he continued. "And when it did, I did the only thing I knew how to do. I wrote it down." He held the notebook high for everyone to see. "This isn't magic. It's not a symbol. It's just paper and ink. But when no one will speak for you, this can become your voice." He turned a page. Because the truth, once written, doesn't flinch. It doesn't forget. And it doesn't care how powerful the person reading it is. Elijah paused, looking out over the silent crowd. "And here's what I want to leave you with today: you do not need permission to stand up for yourself. You do not need to wait until someone says, 'Now's your turn.' Your voice, and your story, are not optional. They are your right." The audience was frozen. Many teachers looked stunned. Several students had tears in their eyes. Even hardened administrators sat straighter in their seats. Elijah stepped back from the microphone. Slowly, he closed the notebook, but instead of slipping it into his backpack, he reached down, and handed it to a younger student sitting near the stage. A girl. Black. Maybe 12. Quiet but sharp-eyed. He smiled at her. "Start your own," he said. Then he walked away. That afternoon, a clip of the speech, titled, "Start Your Own Notebook," exploded online. It was shared by civil rights leaders, financial institutions, and school boards nationwide. Soon, public schools across multiple states introduced the Carter Ledger curriculum, a program designed to teach students how to document discrimination, advocate for themselves respectfully, and understand their rights in professional settings. But more than policy, something else changed. Culture. Kids began carrying small notebooks. Not out of fear, but out of intention. Social workers began to use the phrase, "Write it like Elijah." Teachers began asking, "What's in your ledger?" Even HR departments in major firms began to include notebook training in onboarding for young interns and student employees. And through it all, Elijah Carter remained grounded. He kept his head down. Did his homework. Joined the school debate team. Helped run the student newspaper. When asked by a journalist how it felt to be the face of a movement, he shrugged. I'm not the face. I'm just the first one who refused to let silence win. Months later, during a televised summit on youth leadership and institutional reform, Elijah sat on a panel beside judges, CEOs, and civil rights attorneys. When it was his turn to speak, the host asked, "What makes a good leader?" Elijah didn't hesitate. Someone who doesn't speak to be heard. Someone who writes to remember, and then speaks when others can't. The room fell silent. Not because they didn't understand, but because they did. That night, Daniel Carter stood alone on the rooftop of his firm, the city glowing below him. He wasn't reviewing stocks or deals. He was watching a broadcast replay of his son's summit speech. Behind him, the executive assistant stepped onto the rooftop and quietly said, "You asked me to find one quote for your office wall. I think I have it." She handed him a frame. Inside, engraved in steel. "They may steal your words. But no one can steal the truth, when you write it down." Elijah Carter, age 14. Daniel smiled. For all the mergers and contracts and billion-dollar deals he had closed, nothing ever struck him like watching his son write the future one page at a time. Elijah Carter didn't protest in the streets. He didn't scream. He didn't fight with fists. He observed. He recorded. And when the moment was right, he spoke. And the world listened. If you've ever been silenced, sidelined, or made to feel invisible, remember Elijah's story. Your truth is real. Your voice matters. And even if no one believes you today, write it down anyway. Because the truth, once spoken, can break through any system. What would you write in your notebook? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to True Echo, where justice isn't just a word, it's a story waiting to be told. We'll see you in the next one.